Hey everybody, welcome back to Backlog Banter. I'm your boy Abram, joined as usual by my inquisitive-minded friend Tucker Hazeln. We're here today to talk about the concept of the Nintendo Switch is software library maybe not having a unique identity. But before we share this topic, this discussion, this lecture, if you will, if you want to talk to us about this topic or anything else at all, be sure to join our Discord link as usual, top of the description right down there. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, ring the bell, traditional stuff. This is impromptu because I suggested this topic to Tucker. Tucker started asking me questions. I started speaking and I said, well, this is what I was going to say on camera.
This is a backlog banter video already. We weren't recording it.
Yes.
This kind of 11th hour content used to happen in the early days of BLB when we're just dicking around, but I miss it and I'm glad it's back.
Yeah. So basically what I was saying to Tucker before we began is I do not think that the Nintendo Switch's software library has a distinct identity.
Sure.
And I want to talk a little bit about some of the identities of past systems, and then I want to contrast that against where the Switch is now.
That's what I was going to suggest. So thank you.
We're gonna put together. We're gonna need a fucking board in the background. We can connect strings and things. Make an imaginary board in your mind, everybody. So here's the deal. When you think about Nintendo 64, the Nintendo 64 library had perhaps the most defined identity out of every Nintendo system.
Sure.
And that was multiplayer. It was the multiplayer machine. The games that set the tenor for the machine, outside of very key exceptions being Mario 64, Ocarina of Time, Majora's Mask, are multiplayer games. Smash, Mario Kart 64, Star Fox 64, Mario Party. You can GoldenEye, go on and on and on. They're multiplayer. That was the identity of that system. You look at the GameCube. The GameCube is, from my perspective, the identity of the GameCube is all about experimentation. There's very few direct sequels on GameCube. Mario Party is kind of the big exception. But you went from Mario 64 to Sunshine. You went from Ocarina to Wind Waker. You reinvented Metroid Prime. You brought Animal Crossing into the fold worldwide. You brought Pikmin to the forefront. Games like Chibi Robo. It was an era of experimentation. Donkey Kong, Donkey Kong Jungle Beat being a reboot for the entire franchise, actually moving away from the country stuff. But the point is that the GameCube library on the whole was so experimental, that was the conceit of it. You look at the Wii, and the Wii also clearly defined. It's about the blue ocean philosophy. We play Wii Sports, speak to the old women, speak to the young kids, speak to the fucking elderly, the grandma, even dumb down sometimes your hardcore design philosophies and something like Skyward Sword, make it more accessible, more streamlined. That was what the Wii was. The Wii U also equally defined as being very much iterative upon that, being the first HD system, second screen gameplay. All very much defined ideas.
Sure.
The Wii, the DS's library, dual screen play, touch screen gaming, that's what it was. Yep. Game Boy Color, it was about, that was almost a chameleon design philosophy of matching NES, SNES. It was very much let's bring home console tenants to the handheld. Two exceptions here, and I think they're very similar devices. That's Game Boy Advance and Nintendo Switch. And here's what I'd say about these. Their library's identities are about being greatest hits machines.
Sure.
And I think that in itself is identity, but it is not a defined identity the way these others are. Because you think about the Nintendo Switch's library, broaden it to second party, third party, everything. It is an aggregate of so much of the greatest hits, right? Sure. Wii U ports, Link's Awakening, Let's Go, Mario Party Superstars. Every third-party developer under the fucking sun is bringing their back catalogs to Switch.
Collections, remasters, re-releases, ports, fucking 30,000 hamster games from the fucking Neo Geo.
Yes, that's what defines the library. And then if you even look at Nintendo's original development, a lot of its games are incredibly iterative. Splatoon 2 into Splatoon 3. Breath of the Wild is a Wii U game in the core of its identity. Kirby Star Allies works so heavily off of what came in the past.
Sure.
There are key exceptions to this. Your Super Mario Odysseys, your Animal Crossing New Horizons. I think we're going to get another one in Kirby the Forgotten City next year. We're going to get, Legends Arceus and things. But I really view these as the exception, not the rule. Even something like Mario Tennis Aces, which moves its series forward, is very clearly built on the fucking blood and bones and skeleton of Mario Tennis Aces, or of Mario Tennis Ultra Smash.
Ultra Smash.
Because I don't think there's a clearly defined hardware gimmick, and portability, of course, but portability doesn't intrinsically influence design the way that a Wii remote does.
Sure.
I think that there was no tether there. And so the identity of the Switch has been, considering it brings in lapsed fans, but bringing the greatest hits of all these generations together. It's what the Game Boy Advance did. It was full of ports from Nintendo and remasters, remakes, the biggest games. Your fucking Zero missions, your things like the ports of A Link to the Past, your Mario Advance games, Fire Red, all of this stuff, the Final Fantasy titles, the NES classics, all of these, they're very similar in that sense. I do not think these systems have a defined hardware library identity the way the other systems do. Now, okay. Tucker, I just fucking talked at you.
Yes, you did. Yes, you did. And frankly, that's a great bar to set in terms of clearly defining. And I do agree on everything you said in terms of this is the identity for this, the identity for this, the identity for this. Now, I was thinking the fucking cogs were turning as you were saying this, because frankly, I would say that I disagree about the identity thing, but not because it's not true, but because I don't think it's very important, because I think the identity that the Switch has is actually its strongest suit, which is a few factors that I've been taking notes on so I wouldn't forget these and make sure to bring them up. Now, the first thing, and I think the Switch has fallen out of this since its launch, but is certainly part of its core identity of why it exists, which is incentivizing local co-op in a way that, frankly, not many other Nintendo systems had since the N64 and the Wii. I think are really the highlights of that.
Yeah,
having two controllers built into the system is the first time that two Nintendo controllers have been available with the system, I believe, since the NES, if not, maybe the SNES. But that applies to a lot of those ports of those things that are focusing on local multiplayer in a way that I frankly had almost never played local multiplayer games. Even those Nintendo series like Mario Party or a lot of the Mario Kart games, those were at friend houses experiences. Those were other things, but the combination of the Switch's hardware with the Joy-Con obviously being built into the system and being separated, I see that as a design philosophy of the hardware bleeding into why they choose a lot of these games to be part of this library. You re-release different games from all sorts of different generations because local co-op is instantly available and that it's more accessible than ever. You don't have to dig out the fucking Wii controllers to play multiplayer on the Wii U. You don't have to fucking have all the wired controllers of the N64 or the GameCube. Not that that was a huge problem, but I do think that the Switch has incentivized me to play a lot more co-op because of that design philosophy, but I think a lot of that applies to the games that I'm playing as well, with things like Snipper Clips and 1-2 Switch and ARMS, which of course are all launch year games. But all of those games I think do have that beginning of the Switch life cycle identity of incentivizing local co-op.
I think that is a fantastic point. And if it was a different year, I would agree with you completely. I think your point about those things happening at the beginning is really apt, because we still get some of that. WarioWare Get It Together, its entire conceit is this idea. And I think that of course, the Joy-Con, the form factor of the device does in large part inform a lot of these titles.
The one thing I'm actually thinking about, hold on, just sort of looking through the Switch library that I have pulled up here, is it's really actually rare for a first-party Switch title to be released without any form of local co-op. Well, now those are not. I'm not saying that all these games have the focus being local co-op. But Breath of the Wild and Three Houses. I mean, obviously, Xenoblade Chronicles 2 don't have local co-op, but there is a co-op mode in Mario Party in Odyssey. You can play local co-op in Animal Crossing. Obviously, Smash. They added co-op to Pikmin for the whole campaign. Same with Captain Toad Treasure Tracker, Yoshi's Woolly World. It's really the exceptions are the ones that are exclusively single player,
No.
which is something that you can't actually apply to a lot of other past consoles games.
Well, I think that's a really good point, but I would push back on it in the sense that most Nintendo titles have some degree of multiplayer, you know?
Sure.
And I think that what the Switch does is make that more accessible. And sometimes it is far more centralized in the design philosophy of certain games, as you're saying. But I think at the same time, that's not really the sorts of games that are setting the tenor for the machine.
Sure.
So I just pulled up the list of the top selling Switch games.
Mm-hmm.
Mario Kart 8 Deluxe, very much a local multiplayer experience. So I think you're totally right there.
Yeah.
Animal Crossing New Horizons, primarily a solitary or online title. Super Smash Bros. Ultimate kind of swings every direction. Breath of the Wild, obviously single player only. Pokemon Sword and Shield, single player or online Wi-Fi battling. That really is a solitary experience.
Mm-hmm.
Odyssey, fundamentally a solitary experience unless you're playing with hat mode. Mario Party is an
barely
exception.
counts. I honestly, I was cheesing it to put that on my list.
Yeah. Let's Go, I think, is interesting.
Yeah, that's the one that I was thinking of.
The co-op, I feel there really is shoehorned into the game's philosophy. I think that one can swing either direction.
Though it was a big selling point of that game.
It was a big selling point, but ultimately, like, it didn't really, the game wasn't built for that. I think that was my biggest problem with the co-op there. Like, you just pulled from the same party bag. I think, and I want to actually touch on that because I think you're right about it being a selling point in a moment. But Splatoon 2, online title, Ring Fit Adventure, solitary experience.
Mm-hmm.
I think you're totally right in the idea that this was certainly the thrust at the beginning of the Switch's life.
Yeah,
for sure. Because fucking reveal trailer, iconic, Karen at the rooftop party.
Yes.
And I think that carries through Let's Go. But as we've gotten deeper into the console's life, I think that
has started to dry up. Yeah, for sure.
That has dried up. And I think it was killed with the release of the Switch Lite, which fundamentally makes that no longer a viable core design pillar of the Switch. And I think that's what I'm coming back to. When I'm thinking about identity, I'm thinking about most intrinsic to what the device is.
Sure.
And I think Nintendo themselves have said that, sure, maybe that was our intention at the beginning, and you can point to, as you're saying, a lot of critical examples of that. But I don't think that's how the Switch is going to be remembered, because Nintendo themselves is releasing hardware that directly undercuts that philosophy. And that's why I even think it's challenging to call the identity of this any type of multiplayer, because they're prioritizing the on-the-go experience, which often is at parallel or is at cross purposes with playing multiplayer without an online connection or without breakable Joy-Cons on the Switch Lite to play in handheld mode.
Sure. Yeah. So first part, honestly, I think we kind of met in a middle ground. Yeah. I think that is a part of the Switch's identity. Yeah. It is unfortunate, I would say, that has fallen to the wayside completely, because the initial marketing of the Switch being local multiplayer and single Joy-Con usage was very unique and is reflected in so many of those titles. It's kind of sad that we've lost that, though. I would say that the next point, and why what I really think is the core of the Switch's identity through each of the biggest games on it, why I think that original part is not really that big of a problem, is that the Switch for me is the epitome of what I said in my Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart review at my closing stinger, is the taking the wheel and polishing it until it shines idea, is taking franchises that have been iterated on and making the ultimate version of them. Sometimes, ultimate. But as you look at each of the entries that the Switch has gotten, the exceptions to the rule are sorry, I'm blanking. Star Allies are the really, really iterative ones. Splatoon 2, Splatoon 3, Splatoon sort of its own thing. It's sort of carried over from the Wii U. But when you look at Odyssey, Xenoblade, Breath of the Wild, New Horizons, Fire Emblem Three Houses, Super Smash Bros. Ultimate, and even to some extent, when you look down at like Sword and Shield, each of these games are in very long-running franchises, but are clearly the most ambitious, one of the most ambitious, if not the most ambitious title in their franchise. And I think that it makes it more appealing to a wide stream fan base, avoiding a little bit of that experimentation in in exchange putting a lot of polish and ambition into them.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really great point.
I think you can also add Metroid Dread to that list.
I think you can, but I think the problem with it is that it's an inconsistent philosophy from my perspective, because these are big, but ultimately Odyssey is a step forward, but it is also a step backwards in the sense of it's going back to the 64 and the Sunshine framework. Now, of course, it's taking it in a more Banjo-Kazooie-esque direction, as much as I hate to say the bear and bird here on the channel. But I think that the instances of like truly radical reinvention on Switch are somewhat few and far between, from my opinion. I think Breath of the Wild and New Horizons are the ones that come to mind for me, where they really are taking the franchise in new directions. But then where it gets complicated for me is that Breath of the Wild is not a Switch game. It was not even developed for Switch. You know, it was supposed to release in 2015, supposed to drop holidays.
Would you be allowed yourself to add Sword and Shield and Three Houses to that list? Because I see those as not necessarily the best sticking the landing of that, but a reinvention of those series for home console and making a big expansion to them.
I think those are definitely fair to make. Pretty categorically, I think you're right on those fronts. But I just think that it is this class of games is very complicated, because sometimes it's about returning to form. Sometimes about returning, in the case of like Mario Party, what Mario Party has come on Switch. Sometimes it's about returning to form, but then recontextualizing the form a little bit with Odyssey. Sometimes it is about moving the series really forward with a Breath of the Wild, even though that was a Wii U game in for most of its development life, or a Three Houses, as you're saying, Sword and Shield, New Horizons. But I just think that Nintendo's franchises used to do this more, right? If you want to talk about radical reinvention, you look back to N64, its single player games.
Yeah, of course, naturally.
You look
for
to
a very key reason.
Yeah, you look to GameCube, the scope of experimentation on GameCube, that being the identity across the entirety of the library. Like there was no traditional Kirby game on that system. There's Kirby Air Ride.
Yeah.
The iterative games like a Melee or whatever were the exception, not the rule. Whereas I think the Switch is not pointed as forward as the GameCube was, because so many franchises do look back. So I think what you're getting at is how the Switch has a lot of half identities. It moonlights as a lot of different things, but I don't think it has a central focus the way these other libraries did.
I think that's, as I'm presenting my points and you're very fairly rebutting them. And again, I think we're coming to a middle ground that I think is actually somewhat more interesting when you really compare it to the focus that ended up, for a lot of things, alienating some players from those old franchises or from those old consoles. It is very interesting to have a focused identity of a console, but it can get repetitive. It can alienate certain groups of players. It can leave people feeling like, okay, well, why didn't they do this? I think what we're seeing with the Switch is a melding of identities that in turn boost each other. We're not just getting only multiplayer focused, local multiplayer co-op, whatever, or best of the best reinventions of the franchise. We are getting a combination of the two that I think services both sides of the Nintendo market. And frankly, what I think the Switch will be seen as a reboot of making Nintendo the center of the conversation again. Nintendo has been the weird guy playing with a fucking Wiimote in the corner, as the rest of the industry is graphics, whatever, open world for fucking nonsense. I don't give a shit. I only play Nintendo. Fuck you. But I think that returning the Nintendo as the focus of the conversation, it being the best-selling console of its generation and presumably continuing into the current generation, how it shadows the line, is the Switch's identity. And I think that's more important to Nintendo as a company, to all these franchises, and to gaming as a whole, than having a core identity, having a unique identity in comparison to other Nintendo's consoles. This is a greatest hits, but I think that's important, and I think that's what it should do.
Okay, you're a fucking gentleman and a scholar, because this is my exact thesis statement on this fucking topic. I exist in a fucking stupor in which I just publish work. I don't know where this might have been for Nintendo. This might have been for my fucking blog. This might have been at CBR. I don't remember. It's not important. So at some point in the past 5 years, I published a piece called The Purple Ocean Philosophy. And I think that the Nintendo Switch embodies a purple ocean philosophy in which Nintendo appeals to the blue ocean consumer and the red ocean consumer in equal part. And the console exists at the intersection of that. You mix red and blue, you get purple, as I learned in my classes.
I believe so, yeah.
And I think Tucker...
I have to do a little fact check on that.
Tucker, what you said, I could not say any fucking better. You are absolutely correct. Nintendo's hardware was precipitously declining sales-wise, with the exception of Wii, which is a complete anomaly, because they happened to strike an identity that was not being serviced anywhere else. Mm-hmm. But what the Switch has been able to do very expertly is take tenets of all of those. The fact that you have Super Smash Bros. Ultimate and Ring Fit Adventure in conversation in the list of the best-selling games on Switch's top 10 games is a testament to this philosophy, as you're saying, of taking this hybridized approach, of speaking to the core industry, of speaking to the blue ocean market, of speaking to everybody and centralizing them.
Yeah.
That is why the Switch is selling. That is why the Switch is incredibly important for Nintendo. I think they really had to swallow their pride with the Switch and say it was time to speak to everybody. Mm-hmm. Nintendo is not beating to the sound of their own. They're not marching to the beat of their own drum. This generation, I do not.
Throw a sound in there somewhere.
I really think that Nintendo has lost an identity with the Switch, mm-hmm. but what they found in the place of that was a place in the market, right? and I think that is an unfortunate reality of the fact that Nintendo needed to compromise to succeed, and they compromised with the Switch, and they succeeded. Because Nintendo IP, while I, as a hardcore fan, love the defined console identities, that was what was slowly killing them. Yeah. And they dropped that, and now the Switch is going to surpass 100 million units sold probably by the next financial report.
Yeah.
I think you're 100% correct.
Yeah, it's a fascinating conversation to have, because frankly, when you pitched this topic and started your thesis and fucking talked for 2 hours, my fucking brain trapped. It was crazy. I probably was in a coma. Who knows? But I thought that you were using this as an insult to not. I thought you were saying the Switch is below the other ones because it doesn't have its own identity. Yeah. Not because I see you as a particularly aggressive person, but because the framing of your words, whatever.
Yeah.
Though I think that there is a conversation to have, believe it or not, we're fucking doing it right now, of the lack of identity being something that you can miss.
Yeah.
Because it was very unique and interesting for those old consoles to have that. We also got a lot of those old consoles. That was 20 years of Nintendo history of them having their own identity, a specific niche for each console.
Yeah.
And for me, as a longtime Nintendo fan, I think it really was the purple ocean, as you're saying, and I really hope that catches on, philosophy of the Switch that pulled me back in a stronger way, is being able to service me as someone freshly with my own set of money, which is what really got me into the Switch. But to say, hey, this is not only the Nintendo games, but that are kind of quirky and fun, but the strong, hardcore Nintendo games competing with the other stuff, and some quirky stuff on the side, and a lot of indies and ports of serious games that the other consoles were sorely lacking. The combination of all this is why the Switch is personally my favorite console of all time, and why I think it's one of the strongest Nintendo consoles. And with the combination of identities in its library, I think it gives it a breadth that the other consoles maybe didn't necessarily have. You can, as you said, have Ring Fit Adventure and WarioWare get it together with Breath of the Wild and Super Smash Bros. Ultimate.
Yeah.
And I don't necessarily know if that would have been possible on those older consoles.
No, you're totally right. It was not possible. And this is why the Switch, and this is kind of where I've settled my mind. Of course, the generation is not done, and we'll revisit this conversation when it is. But I think that the Switch is perhaps Nintendo's best console, but it will never be my favorite because of this very conversation.
Okay, yeah,
and that's where I settle on it in my own mind. because I do miss that identity.
Yeah.
And so I'm not insulting the Switch when I say this, but I am explaining why it will never hold the place in my heart that the GameCube does, for instance.
Sure. Yeah.
Because the GameCube or the Wii U or whatever, some of these really, or the Wii, the really defined ones. It just, that was part of why I found Nintendo so interesting.
Yeah.
And the fact of the matter is that was not sustainable. And I want Nintendo to never go away.
Yeah.
I think Nintendo going third party kills the company. And that's a different conversation to have at another time. I think we're reaching a point where we can have that conversation without being fucking click mongering idiots, like how that conversation would happen back in 2016 or something. But
yeah,
Nintendo needs a place. Nintendo needs their own ecosystem to thrive.
Yeah.
And the way to have a healthy Nintendo ecosystem is to give a little. And I will happily give up the ability for the Switch to be my favorite Nintendo console for it to be an incredibly successful one that often kind of passes me by. I kind of feel like I'm at a point right now where the number of Switch titles I love is getting less and less as the generation progresses. But every once in a while, a Metroid Dread slips through the goal or whatever, right? And that makes me so happy. But or a WarioWare, or I get to fuck around with Nintendo Labo, right? All these things.
Yeah.
But all of this happens because Nintendo found footing again. And Nintendo found footing because they bent. Yeah. And they had to bend.
What's most fascinating to me about this concept that I have kind of just clicked for myself of this being a reboot to Nintendo being the center of conversation, as they really weren't for 20 years. I mean, maybe the last time was the N64 or something like that, and the Wii. But okay, so maybe they were for more of that than I'm.
Well, I know. I think you're totally right. I think it'd be incorrect to say that there's some center of attention for either of those.
Okay.
I think the last time that they really dominated conversation was the SNES.
Sure. Because the N64 was a lot of like, oh well, the PlayStation has the third-party games and is stronger and is better graphics and more mature and all that stuff.
Nintendo had very influential games in the 5th gen. They were the place for multiplayer. In 7th gen, they set the tenor for forcing Sony and Microsoft to follow suit in terms of having a Kinect, or basically just a motion control solution. But they were never considered equal. Ever in the connotation. They never got this. They never got the games. They never got the respect. It has Nintendo. You're totally right. Is what I'm saying.
Yeah, but what I'm saying about that is that this clicking in my mind makes it really interesting to future project Nintendo 2 generations from now, because I believe that there is a good chance that we get one more Switch style give a little console that matches them all. But I believe that Nintendo will once again devolve into the madness of experimentation and creativity. Whoa, spooky. But I can see 3 generations from now, hardware sales decreasing, but they're leaning back on the fucking gallons of Scrooge McDuck riches that they've built up with the Switch, that it won't matter to them. And we can once again lean back into what you're saying and have a console with a super strong identity, like happened with the NES. The NES and the SNES forefront of the conversation. But they made themselves a household name with that, and they were able to go downhill but uphill in creativity. And I think maybe what we're just seeing is the start of a rebirth of Nintendo's creativity. By sacrificing their identity, I think they'll be able to build it back even stronger 10 years from now.
See, it's interesting you say this, because I actually don't agree. I think it's over.
Okay.
And the reason I think it's over is because Nintendo isn't Nintendo as it used to be.
That's a good point. Changes of fucking management.
That is really the core of it, right? The Iwata era was a defined era. I think that is the most interesting and fun era of Nintendo. It's one I grew up in. It's the one that when I think back retrospectively on it, it means the most to me. I think they're at their smartest, the most interesting, the most daring. That's gone, and there will never be another Satoru Iwata. And I think that the Switch was put in place by him, but it was led by men like Kimishima, who pushed us in a different direction. And we're seeing old heads like Shigeru Miyamoto be a producer. He's not directing Mario. Koizumi's directing Mario. I think we're going to see Aonuma step down before too long. I think as the guard changes, we're seeing Nintendo move in the Switch direction, which is profitable and younger and newer, but it's closer to Apple. It's closer to the competitor. It's not rooted in these incredibly brilliant and inventive, but old and set in their ways Japanese
Sure.
men who were running the company.
Yeah.
And because of that, I just simply do not think we're ever going to get it again.
Sure.
But I think that perhaps that is the shell Nintendo had to shed to be, as you're saying, at the forefront of the conversation again, because I think the next Nintendo system, frankly, is going to be very powerful. And I think it's going to be, I think it's going to be powerful. I think it's going to be expensive. And the minute that happens, Nintendo, as we knew it, is gone. But a company has to evolve to stay around. And I think that we're on the precipice of Gunpei Yokoi's philosophies, Iwata's philosophies, Miyamoto's philosophies being forgotten. And that's sad, but I think it is inevitable.
Yeah. And would you say that, well, here's the thing. I agree with you. I think that's pretty much not, there's no argument about that.
Yeah.
These guys are literally dying. They will die within the next 15 years. And before that, they will no longer be involved with the company. And I think that's going to be, frankly, an almost more interesting change for me as someone who has been entrenched in Nintendo's culture and history, seeing what the new face of Mario will be, seeing what direction things can take without, in some ways, Miyamoto holding them back with the older design philosophies that don't mesh with modern creators and modern consumer philosophies. So as someone who loves the old Nintendo, I think there is a chance that I will have a greater respect for that shedding of that shell to trying something radically different that began with the Switch. And it could, and I think it will greatly benefit them in the wider consumer base, as you know, we've seen with the Switch. But personally, I'm very excited for that. All we can hope, and I think that there is still that spark of hope, is that there are other creative people out there. We haven't seen the end of creative Nintendo. I honestly don't think we've seen the end of someone like Miyamoto. I believe there will be a next Iwata, there will be a next Miyamoto. They won't be the same, but they could be equally as brilliant. And I think that's very exciting to think about.
No, I agree. And I think some of them are here right now. I think Koizumi is as inventive as Miyamoto was. Odyssey is incredible. It's just a different kind of incredible. And that's my thing. I think that the reality is that the old Nintendo is dying. I'm always going to have that old Nintendo. You know, I'm getting older. I'm making more money. I'm building out that GameCube collection. At a certain point, my fucking Nintendo is the different company, Fallout Bunker is going to be complete. I'm going to have all the old stuff. But I think there's something really powerful and necessary about these younger gentlemen stepping into these roles and moving Nintendo in a different direction. And mark my fucking words. We'll have this conversation again when the next console gets announced in a couple of years. It will not be informed by lateral thinking with withered technology. And I agree with you. I'd have big respect for that happening. Would it radically change a lot about what I like about the company? Absolutely. But that's so interesting. Because Iwata did it, and Iwata ushered in what I think is the most brilliant era of the company. So let's do it again. And maybe that means it moves closer to Apple, but Apple's a fucking juggernaut, right?
We'll see. The most expensive fucking company on the planet or whatever.
We'll see. My entire point is that Nintendo is changing, and they're never going to be the same.
That could be pretty cool, but we've obviously yet to see 2020. Oh, Christ! 2022 is looking very promising for Nintendo. It is looking a little bit sad in terms of the creativity, because we are seeing sparks of that with Kirby and the Forgotten Land, but for the most part, these are iterative, big budget, game of the year contender sequels that will sell gazongas and push this Switch to even greater heights. But outside of 2017, that's kind of the first year we've seen Nintendo really lean into that. So by default, it'll be a very unique year for Nintendo, even if it's not exciting from that creativity front. But then what happens in 2023? What happens with the launch of the next console? Do we get another wave of that? Do we get a return to the creativity of the launch Switch era that we've discussed with local co-op and fucking ARMS and 1-2 Switch and all that? It's still all out there. And the one thing that I still hold in my fucking pocket is Reggie saying at one point that the Switch does want to have a lot of new first-party IP. That hasn't happened. There's been a trickle But I want there to be that boom at some point, and I do think that it could be inevitable as we see these refresh sequels come out. Then what? You know?
We're seeing Nintendo build a new 900 person office space right now in
Really?
Japan. Yeah,
Wow.
to expand first party development. So we could be on the precipice of it. Furukawa has reiterated that new IP is coming.
Really? Yes. Okay.
Yeah.
Great.
We'll see.
Ideal.
We'll see. Anything else you want to add, Tucker?
Mm-mm.
Am I recording again?
Fuck you, Nintendo. Make another Chibi Robo. Stop making fucking Splatoon 3.
Ziplash sequel, please.